Tonight, we journey to a world balanced on the edge of a spear. It is a story of two empires, one ancient, wealthy, and stretching to the boundaries of the known world. The other, new, relentless, and driven by the will of a single man who believed he was a god. One king gathered the largest army in history to protect his throne. The other marched across the deserts of the east to take it. What follows is not merely a battle. It is the story of a promise kept, a fatal miscalculation, and the violent passing of an entire age, all decided by the events of a single dawn. Settle in, and let us travel back to the definitive clash of the ancient world.
Our story begins not on the dusty plains of Gaugamela, but 2 years earlier, in the immediate, chaotic aftermath of another battle. At Issus, Darius III, the great king of Persia, had fled. He had fled in such panic that he abandoned everything: his chariot, his royal shield, and his family. In the gathering darkness, the Macedonian conqueror, Alexander, walked into the captured royal tent of Persia. It was a world of unimaginable luxury, but amidst the gold and the silks there was only terror. The mother of Darius, Scythed, and his wife, Tyre, believed they were moments from death or humiliation. This was the custom of their world. Conquerors did not show mercy to the families of their rivals. When Alexander entered the tent, accompanied by his closest friend Hephaestion, the aged Scythed did not know which man was the king. Hephaestion was taller, and perhaps looked more traditionally regal. She knelt before him. Hephaestion stepped back, and an attendant frantically corrected her mistake. Scythed, horrified at the offense, fell before the true king. Alexander reached down and lifted the elderly queen to her feet. And then he said the words that would shake the Persian Empire more than any spear. He looked at her kindly and said, "You were not mistaken, mother. For he too is Alexander." With this gesture, Alexander did more than spare them. He adopted them. He promised them their titles, their servants, and their honor, assuring them they would live as queens. In doing so, he sent a message to Darius and to all of Asia. He was not just a barbarian conqueror. He was behaving like the true king. Darius, hearing this news from afar, was shamed. He had abandoned his family. His rival had honored them. But Alexander knew that honor alone would not win the war. Darius had fled east, back toward the heartland of his empire, to Mesopotamia, where he could raise a new army. Logic dictated that Alexander must pursue him immediately. But Alexander looked at the map of the world, and he saw a different problem. The Persian fleet. It was vast, powerful, and controlled the entire Mediterranean Sea. As long as that fleet existed, it could land troops behind him, cut off his supplies, and ignite rebellion in the Greek cities he had left behind. He could not chase the Persian fleet on the water. He did not have the ships, so he decided he would defeat the navy by taking away the land. He would conquer every port they called home. He marched south, down the coast of Phoenicia. City after city opened its gates. Sidon, Byblos, they welcomed him. And then he arrived at the island city of Tyre. Tyre was not just a city. It was a fortress. It sat half a mile out in the deep water, an island surrounded by sheer walls, 150 feet high. The Tyrians were masters of the sea, wealthy and arrogant. They trusted their walls and they trusted their navy. They looked down upon the young Macedonian and his land-based army, and they refused him entry. They believed themselves untouchable. They had severely miscalculated the will of the man standing on their shore. If Alexander could not reach the island, he decided he would bring the land to the island. He ordered his engineers to build a causeway, a massive land bridge, 200 feet wide, straight across the open sea toward the city walls. It was an impossible task. Tens of thousands of men began dumping rocks and sinking giant timbers into the water. The Tyrians watched, first in amusement, then in alarm. They attacked the project relentlessly. They sent fire ships filled with burning pitch to smash into the mole and set the siege towers ablaze. They launched projectiles from their walls. Storms washed away months of work in a single night. Any other commander would have abandoned the siege. But Alexander saw it as a personal challenge, his will against the sea itself. He rebuilt. He gathered his own fleet from the cities that had surrendered, blockading Tyre by water, even as he approached by land. For 7 brutal months, the work continued. The mole crept closer and closer, a testament to sheer obsessive determination. Finally, the land bridge touched the stone foundations of Tyre. Siege towers, floating on ships, hammered the walls. The breach was made. Alexander himself led the charge into the dying city. The victory was total, and the vengeance was horrific. Thousands were slaughtered. Tens of thousands more were sold into slavery. Alexander had spent 7 months conquering one city, all to remove a single, vital port from Persian control. While Alexander was anchored at Tyre, building his bridge of earth and stone, far to the east, King Darius was also building. He was gathering horses from Scythia, elephants from India, and infantry from Bactria. He was forging longer spears and designing new, terrifying weapons. He was preparing for the final battle, on ground of his own choosing, determined that this time the young conqueror would not merely be fighting men. He would be fighting the combined weight of the entire world. With the smoke of Tyre fading behind him, and the coast of Phoenicia secured, Alexander turned his army south once more. Gaza, the last stubborn fortress on the road to the oldest kingdom on earth, fell after another brutal siege. Now, only the harsh Sinai desert separated his army from the prize of Egypt. Egypt, a land that was already ancient when the heroes of Greece were myth. It was a civilization built on the rhythm of the Nile, ruled by pharaohs who were living gods. For the last century, it had suffered under the heavy hand of Persian rule. The Persian kings had been harsh masters. They insulted the Egyptian gods, desecrated temples, and placed heavy taxes on the people. Egypt did not love its Persian rulers. It merely endured them. The Persian governor, a satrap named Mazaches, knew this. He had also heard the impossible news from the north. He knew that the great King Darius had fled at Issus. He knew that the invincible island of Tyre had been conquered by a man who built roads upon the sea. Mazaces had few Persian troops, and he knew the Egyptian people would not fight for him. He was a practical man. When Alexander marched his army out of the desert, he was not met with spears. He was met with celebration. The Egyptian people hailed him not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. Mazaces, seeing the inevitable, wisely surrendered the entire kingdom. The treasury, the cities, and the crown of the 2 lands were handed over without a single drop of blood. Alexander entered the ancient capital of Memphis, not as a Greek victor, but as a true pharaoh. He was a political genius as much as a military one. He did not impose his own gods. Instead, he made a great sacrifice to the Apis bull, the most sacred of all Egyptian deities, the very one the Persians had mocked. By this single act, he healed a nation's spiritual wound. The priests, overjoyed, officially crowned him pharaoh, the legitimate successor to the ancient kings. But for Alexander, becoming king of Egypt was not enough. He had heard stories of a place deep within the Libyan desert, a place of profound mystery. Hundreds of miles to the west, isolated by a sea of burning sand, lay the Siwa oasis. And within that oasis stood the temple of the Oracle of Zeus Ammon. This oracle was as famous and perhaps as powerful as the oracle at Delphi. Its priests supposedly knew the secrets of destiny. For a normal man, the journey was suicidal. The desert was trackless, waterless, and unforgiving. Entire armies had been swallowed by its sands. His generals urged him against it. There was no strategic reason to go. It was a detour of weeks while Darius was still at large. But this was not a strategic mission. It was a personal pilgrimage. Alexander, the man who had outperformed every hero, needed to know who he truly was. He needed to ask the god not just about his future, but about his past. He needed to know if Philip of Macedon was truly his father. He took only a small chosen escort and marched west, into the void. The desert tested them. They ran out of water. Their guides became lost in the endless, shifting dunes. The men began to despair. Then the sky broke. A sudden violent rainstorm erupted in the middle of the desert, drenching the expedition and filling their water skins. It was seen as the first sign. A miracle. Days later, still lost, 2 black crows appeared in the sky. The birds did not attack. Instead, they flew slowly ahead of the column, cawing, waiting for the men to catch up, guiding them turn by turn across the wastes. Finally, on the horizon, the impossible appeared, a vibrant splash of green. It was Siwa. The oasis was a paradise of palms and cool springs, dominated by the ancient temple. The high priest of Ammon knew who was coming. He greeted Alexander not as a mortal king, but as something more. Alexander was ushered alone into the innermost, holiest sanctuary of the temple. No one else was permitted to enter. No one knows exactly what words were spoken in the darkness of that sacred room. But when Alexander emerged, he was changed. He was serene. He was complete. He would only say that he had received the answer his heart desired. The rumor, however, spread like fire through the army and the world. The high priest had greeted Alexander not merely as a king, but as the son of Zeus Ammon. For Alexander, the question was settled. He was divine. His destiny was not just to conquer Persia. It was to rule the world. He returned from the desert with this divine certainty and marched to the coast. He sailed down the Nile Delta until he found the perfect strip of land, a natural harbor protected from the sea on one side and anchored by a freshwater lake on the other.
Here, he declared, he would build his new capital, a city that would link Egypt to Greece. He took a measure of barley flour and began tracing the outlines of streets and temples directly onto the dark soil. As he drew the foundations of his dream,
vast flocks of birds descended from the sky and ate the barley grains. His seers worried it was a bad omen. But Alexander smiled and declared it a perfect sign. It meant that his new city, Alexandria, would one day grow to feed the world, and all this time, hundreds of leagues to the east, in the grand halls of Babylon, the other king was working. Darius III was not seeking gods. He was organizing mortals. Darius was far from beaten. He was the administrator of the wealthiest empire on earth. He had learned the bitter lessons of Issus. He now knew his infantry was no match for the Macedonian phalanx. He knew his armies had been too slow. He would not make those mistakes again. He sent riders to the farthest corners of his empire. He called upon the fearsome horsemen of Scythia, the warriors of Bactria, the mountain tribes of Sogdia, and even soldiers from the edges of India, who brought with them 15 war elephants, creatures the Macedonians had never seen. He did not just rebuild his army, he reformed it. He issued longer swords and heavier spears, trying to mimic the weapons of his enemy. But his greatest hope, his secret weapon, lay in his workshops. He had commissioned 200 scythed chariots. These were tanks of the ancient world. Heavy chariots with sharp, curving blades mounted onto the wheels and the yoke, designed not just to break an enemy line, but to slice it to pieces. For 2 years, while Alexander was at Tyre and Siwa, Darius gathered his strength. He was not a fool. He knew Alexander would come. He knew the Macedonian phalanx was invincible from the front. But with his new chariots, his elephants, and an ocean of cavalry, Darius planned to shatter Alexander's flanks and swallow his army whole. He was not just raising an army, he was raising an avalanche, and he would wait for Alexander to come and die on a battlefield that Darius himself would choose. With the blessing of the oracle secured and his divine destiny affirmed, Alexander turned his mind back to the mortal world. He left the ancient land of Egypt stabilized, wealthy, and loyal. He had founded his great city, a beacon that would soon draw the scholars and merchants of the world. His rear flank, the entire coastline of the Mediterranean, was now secure. There were no more Persian ports. There was no more Persian fleet to threaten Greece or cut his supplies. There was only the east. There was only Darius. In the spring of 331 BC, Alexander the Great gathered his army at Tyre, the city he had conquered by building a bridge upon the sea. He stood on the shore he had created and gave the order. The entire Macedonian army, 40,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry, turned its back on the familiar blue of the Great Sea and began the long march toward the heart of Asia. This was a journey unlike any they had ever undertaken. This was not a march along coastal roads. This was a plunge into the vast, unknown interior of the Persian Empire. They marched under a relentless summer sun, moving northeast through Syria, their eyes set on the twin great rivers of civilization, the Euphrates and the Tigris. As they marched, the empire of Darius seemed to shrink away from them. Scouts rode far ahead, expecting resistance, but they found none. When the army reached the mighty Euphrates River, they found the crossing undefended. Darius's regional general, Mazaeus, had been ordered to guard the passage, but he retreated, offering only a token resistance before vanishing eastward. This was not cowardice. This was strategy. This was the trap. Darius did not want to fight Alexander at the river. He did not want to give Alexander an easy escape route back to the sea. Darius wanted the Macedonians deep within his territory, cut off, exhausted, and surrounded. He was baiting the trap, and Alexander was willingly walking into it. The Macedonians crossed the Euphrates unopposed, the heavy infantry feeling the strange current pull at their legs, knowing that with every step their homeland grew farther away, and their retreat route became more precarious. Once across, they found the land had been burned. Mazaeus, retreating before them, had torched the villages and the fields, destroying the food and fodder. This scorched earth policy forced Alexander to abandon the direct route south across the desert toward Babylon. He was forced to march north, following the curve of the river into Armenia, just to keep his army fed, before turning south again. Weeks later, they reached the second river, the Tigris. This one was more formidable. It was deeper, faster, and colder than the Euphrates. The current was violent. Again, the crossing was undefended. The soldiers had to link arms, forming human chains against the force of the water, holding their shields and their precious sarissa spears high above their heads. They struggled across man and horse, fighting the river itself. But they made it. They were now in Mesopotamia, the heartland of the ancient world, and the personal domain of the great king. The silence from the Persian army was unnerving. They had now crossed both great barriers, and still the enemy remained a rumor. The tension in the Macedonian camp was heavy. Then, 6 days after crossing the Tigris, the sky itself turned against them. On the night of September 20th, the moon, full and bright over the Mesopotamian plain, began to die. A shadow crept across its face, staining it a deep, terrifying blood red. It was a total lunar eclipse. To the soldiers, this was an omen of profound and terrible power. The army began to panic. This strange eastern land, they whispered, was protected by angry gods. The moon was disappearing, and with it their courage. This was a moment of crisis more dangerous to Alexander than any spear. But Alexander, the man who had sacrificed to the Apis bull and walked to Siwa, understood the power of belief. He did not panic. He had brought his own Egyptian priests with him, men who understood the predictable rhythms of the heavens. They calmly explained to the army that this was not magic, but a natural, predictable event. Then Alexander the propagandist took over. His own Greek seers, led by Aristander, declared that this was indeed an omen, but not for them. The sun, they proclaimed, was the emblem of Macedon. The moon was the protector of Persia. For the moon to be eclipsed, for its light to be blotted out by the shadow of the earth, was a divine sign. It meant the light of Persia was about to be extinguished. Alexander immediately ordered grand sacrifices to the moon, the earth, and the sun, turning an event of terror into a promise of victory. Morale surged back. The army was now convinced the gods were on their side. They rested for 2 days, then continued their march south, moving slowly, cautiously. The enemy was near. Alexander himself rode ahead with the scout cavalry. Finally, they crested a small ridge and collided with an enemy patrol, 1,000 Persian horsemen. A short, sharp skirmish erupted. The Macedonians won the engagement, and most importantly, they captured several prisoners. The prisoners were brought before the king.
Shaking with fear, they told him everything. The wait was over. Darius and his grand army were not in Babylon.
They were here. They were just miles away. They were waiting on a vast, wide plain near the village of Gaugamela. And the army was not just large. It was, the prisoners swore, nearly 1 million men. They had elephants. They had warriors from India. And they had 200 chariots with blades fixed to their wheels. The great king had finished organizing. The trap was set. Alexander had found his battle. He led his army forward a few more miles, until he could see the distant watchfires of the largest army ever assembled. He ordered his men to halt and to make camp. The final confrontation was now only a few miles, and one long night away. When the morning sun rose, Alexander led his generals forward to the crest of the low hills that separated the two camps. From this vantage point, for the first time, they truly saw what Darius had built. It was not merely an army, it was a nation in arms. Across the vast flat expanse, the Persian line stretched for more than 3 miles. It was so wide that the Macedonians on their hill could barely see the ends of it. The morning light glinted on 100,000 spear points. The air was heavy with the distant sound of an empire waiting, the low murmur of countless languages, the neighing of tens of thousands of horses, the occasional trumpeting roar of the war elephants, restless in their lines. The prisoners had not exaggerated. This was the largest, most terrifying army the world had ever produced. And then they saw the field itself, Parmenion. The old and cautious general who had served Alexander's father scanned the terrain. His heart grew heavy. This was nothing like Issus. 2 years earlier, the battle had been fought in a narrow pass between the mountains and the sea. That narrow space had been Alexander's ally. It had acted like a funnel, neutralizing the massive Persian numbers, forcing them into a head-on collision that the superior Macedonian phalanx was guaranteed to win. This place was the opposite. This was a wide, open ocean of earth. There were no mountains to protect their flanks. There were no rivers to anchor their line. It was a cavalryman's dream, and Darius, the Macedonians knew, outnumbered their cavalry by at least 5 to 1. The plan of the great king was clear, simple, and deadly. He would use his endless line to envelop them. His cavalry would crash around their flanks, lapping behind them like a wave, surrounding them completely, pinning the phalanx in place while the rest of his army crushed it from all sides. It was a perfect strategy for this perfect terrain. But as Alexander studied the ground, he noticed something else. Something obsessive. The ground directly in front of the Persian center did not look natural. It looked clean. It was perfectly flat, as if it had been swept. Alexander and his officers rode closer, just beyond bowshot, scanning the center of the field. They realized Darius had spent months preparing this ground. He had ordered thousands of laborers to go out onto the plain to remove every rock, fill every ditch, and level every slight mound of earth. Darius had not just chosen his battlefield. He had engineered it. He had created an artificial killing floor. He had done this for one reason. His secret weapon, the 200 scythed chariots. Alexander had heard reports of these machines, but now, seeing the ground prepared for them, he understood the terror they were meant to inflict. These were not the light chariots of the past, used for skirmishing. These were heavy armored weapons of shock and awe. Long curved blades, sharp as razors, were bolted to the chariot wheels, parallel to the ground. More spears and blades pointed forward from the harness. They were designed to be driven at a full gallop straight into the densest infantry formation in the world, the Macedonian phalanx. Darius believed these chariots were the key to victory. He believed they would solve the problem of the phalanx. The Macedonians fought with 16-foot spears, the sarissa, creating an impenetrable wall of spear points. The scythed chariots, Darius reasoned, would slam into that wall, their blades shattering the wooden spears, cutting the legs from beneath the front ranks of soldiers, and carving horrific bloody gaps in the impregnable line. Into these gaps, his best infantry and cavalry would pour, destroying the phalanx from the inside out. But this weapon had one critical weakness. It required perfect terrain. A single unseen rock or a shallow ditch would catch a blade or a wheel at high speed, flipping the chariot and turning the terrifying weapon into a useless, tangled wreck, often killing its own driver. This was Darius's obsession. This was why he had burned the lands near the Euphrates. This was why he had let Alexander cross the Tigris unopposed. He had wanted desperately to lure Alexander to this one specific place, this flat, prepared, artificial plain, where his chariots could not fail. Seeing this, the Macedonian generals grew quiet. They were not just outnumbered. They had been led willingly onto a killing floor that had been designed meticulously for the precise purpose of destroying their army. The trap was visible and it was perfect. Alexander, however, saw something different. He saw an opponent who was betting everything on a single tactic, on a single weapon, that only worked on a specific, clearly defined patch of ground. He saw the boundaries where the leveled earth ended, and where the natural uneven plain began. His mind began to work, not on how to survive the chariot charge, but on how to make it completely irrelevant. He finished his survey, his plan already forming. He turned his horse and led his generals back to the Macedonian camp. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon. The vast armies watched each other across the plain. The longest night of their lives was about to begin. As the sun set, the sky over the Mesopotamian plain turned a deep, bruised purple. The chill of the desert night began to settle over the two armies. Alexander returned to his tent and summoned his generals for the final war council. The mood was heavy. The commanders had all seen the endless line of the Persian army. They had seen the unnaturally leveled plain, waiting for the scythed chariots. They had done the calculations. They were outnumbered at every point, and they were standing on terrain hand-picked by the enemy to destroy them. The silence was broken by Parmenion. He was the most experienced general in the army, a man who had fought for Alexander's father, Philip. He was the anchor, the voice of caution and reason. He stood, and he made his case, not with fear, but with cold, hard logic. He argued that to fight in the daylight was suicide. It was exactly what Darius wanted. It was walking into a trap, knowingly. The open field would allow the Persian cavalry to swarm their flanks. The leveled ground would give the chariots their perfect run. To fight on Darius's terms, Parmenion said, was to lose. Therefore, he proposed the only other option, a night attack. The logic was sound. In the chaos and confusion of the darkness, Persian numbers would be meaningless. Their vast, unwieldy army, composed of dozens of nationalities speaking different languages, would fall into disarray. A swift, disciplined Macedonian assault could strike directly at the royal tent, capture or kill Darius, and scatter the Persian host before the sun ever rose. It was a classic tactic for an inferior force. Use stealth and precision to negate the enemy's brute strength. It was the smart move. It was the sensible move, the other generals murmured in agreement. This was the only way. Alexander listened patiently, his gaze fixed on the old general. When Parmenion had finished, the tent was silent. Alexander stood. He refused. His answer was simple, and it would become legendary. I will not, he said, steal my victory. The generals were stunned. But Alexander explained his reasoning. It was not mere arrogance. A night attack, he argued, was just as dangerous for the attacker. In the darkness, his own men could get lost. His phalanx could become disordered, and they could be the ones enveloped and cut down by a panicked, but superior force. But more importantly, he was not there to simply win. He was not there to spook the great king and make him run away again, only to raise a third army. He was there to end the Persian Empire, forever. To do that, he needed to annihilate its army, publicly, decisively, in the full light of day. He needed to prove, to the world and to the Persians themselves, that his army was superior and that his destiny was manifest. He had to beat Darius at his own game, on the very field Darius had chosen. He would not win by stealth. He would win by genius. He dismissed the stunned council. His final orders were shocking in their simplicity and their profound confidence. Go, he told his generals. Tell the men to eat a full meal, to clean their equipment, and to check their spears. And then tell them to get a full night of sleep. The order spread through the Macedonian camp. The soldiers, who had been nervously anticipating the coming battle, felt a wave of relief and awe. Their king, their God-born leader, was so confident in the outcome that he had ordered them to bed. They trusted him completely. The tension vanished. Fires were lit. Men ate their fill, joked, and checked their gear. And then, as the darkness deepened, the entire Macedonian army, 47,000 men, on the eve of the battle that would decide the fate of the world, went to sleep. The camp fell into a deep, quiet, and peaceful rest. Now, let us travel 2 miles across that dark, cold plain to the Persian lines. In the royal pavilion of Darius, a very different council was taking place. And Darius, along with all of his generals, had come to the exact same conclusion as Parmenion. They were absolutely convinced that Alexander, facing such impossible odds, had no choice but to launch a desperate night attack. It was the only thing a sane commander would do. Darius, unlike Alexander, was not a gambler. He was a cautious administrator. He had been surprised at Issus and had lost. He would not be surprised again. He was terrified of being caught in the dark, his massive army asleep and vulnerable. So, he issued his own order. It was the single most disastrous decision of the campaign. He commanded the entire Persian army to remain awake. All of them! They were to stand in their full battle formations, in complete armor, at their assigned posts for the entire night. They were to be ready, at any moment, for the Macedonian attack that would never come. And so the longest night began. The hours dragged on. The Mesopotamian desert air grew bitterly cold. The Persian soldiers, wearing their metal armor, shivered in the darkness. They stood waiting. Their horses, already saddled and bridled for the battle, remained tied in their lines, unable to rest. Every gust of wind, every cry of a desert jackal, every distant noise from the sleeping Macedonian camp was mistaken for the beginning of the assault. Nerves frayed. The massive army, 1 million strong, stood in the dark, growing more exhausted, more anxious, and more demoralized with every passing hour. They had been told they were an invincible host, but now their king was so afraid of the tiny army across the plain that he was forcing them to stand guard all night, like frightened sentries. By the time the first faint, gray light of dawn finally touched the eastern horizon, the Persian army had been standing at attention for more than 8 hours. They were cold, they were hungry, they were physically and mentally exhausted, and across the plain, the Macedonian army, well-fed and having slept soundly, began to wake. The battle, in many ways, had already been won. The sun rose, painting the eastern sky in shades of pale gold and rose. It revealed the two armies, facing each other in the cold morning light, two worlds poised for collision. The Macedonians, rested and well-fed, woke to the sound of their officers. They formed their ranks with the crisp, disciplined efficiency of a professional army. There was a story told that Alexander himself, having borne the mental strain of the past days, slept so deeply that morning that Parmenion had to come and wake him, surprised at his calm. Alexander simply rose, put on his iconic polished breastplate, and prepared for the day. Across the plain, the Persian army, a vast, sleepless horizon of men, watched them. They had been standing in the cold for hours, their limbs stiff, their nerves frayed. They were an empire on the verge of exhaustion, facing a rested, coiled spring. Slowly, methodically, the chessboard was set. Let us first paint the picture of the Persian line, a great wave stretching for miles. In the exact center, as was the tradition of the Persian kings, sat Darius III upon his high royal chariot. He was surrounded by the best of his best. In front of him, as a terrifying vanguard, were the 15 Indian war elephants, their presence intended to sow panic among the Macedonian horses. Beside them were the 200 scythed chariots, the blades on their wheels gleaming, waiting for the signal. Behind this screen, Darius was protected by his personal guard, the 10,000 royal immortals, the elite heavy infantry of the empire, and a large contingent of Greek mercenary hoplites, soldiers who fought in the same style as the Macedonians, and who represented Darius's best hope of countering the phalanx. On his right flank, facing the Macedonian left, Darius had placed his general Mazaeus. Mazaeus commanded the heavy cavalry from Mesopotamia, Syria, and Cappadocia. This was a massive, powerful wing, and its orders were simple: crush the Macedonian left flank, which was Darius's primary objective. On his left flank, facing Alexander's right, he had placed Bessus, the satrap of Bactria. Bessus commanded the fearsome horsemen from the Eastern Empire, the Bactrians, the Sogdians and the wild nomadic Scythians, perhaps the finest light cavalry in the world. Darius's plan was built on his numbers. His two vast cavalry wings would wheel inward, enveloping the tiny Macedonian line. They would crash into the Macedonian rear, and the battle would be over in an hour. Then, there was the Macedonian formation. It looked like a tiny, fragile line against the Persian Ocean. But it was a line designed by a genius. On the far left, Alexander placed Parmenion. The old general was given the hardest, most thankless job of the day. He commanded the Thessalian cavalry and the allied Greek infantry. He was heavily outnumbered by Mazias. His orders were not to win. He was not to advance. He was simply to hold. He was the anvil upon which the battle would be struck. He was to bend, to give ground if necessary, but he was not, under any circumstances, to break. In the center was the heart of the army, the Macedonian phalanx. 6 brigades, nearly 10,000 men, a solid wall of iron and wood. They deployed in their deep formations, their 16-foot sarissa spears resting on their shoulders, ready to be lowered into a forest of unstoppable points. On the far right, Alexander took his traditional post. Here, he commanded the striking arm of the army, the elite of the elite, the companion cavalry, the finest heavy horsemen in the world. With him were the hypaspists, his own royal foot guards, and the light javelin men, the Agrianians. This was the hammer, but the formation was not what it seemed. Alexander had designed it to counter Darius's specific plan. First, the line was not straight. Alexander had angled his entire right wing forward, while holding his left wing back. The army was deployed at an oblique angle, like a slanted line. Second, and most critically, was what the Persians could not see. Behind his front line, on both the left and the right flanks, Alexander had hidden another secondary line of infantry. These were the antiphalanx, the flank guards. They were reserves deployed at an angle, and their orders were revolutionary. If, or rather when, the Persian cavalry swarmed around the flanks, this hidden line was not to panic. They were to turn 90 degrees, form a new defensive front and meet the charge, effectively turning the Macedonian line into a hollow, defensive box. Alexander had anticipated the envelopment and had built a trap for a trap. His own plan was daring, complex, and required perfect timing. Parmenion would be the bait, absorbing the main Persian assault on the left. Alexander on the right would do something completely unexpected. He would not charge forward. He would begin to march his entire wing diagonally to the right, seemingly marching off the edge of the battlefield. This march was designed to do 2 things. First, it would draw the Persian left wing under Bessus to follow him, stretching the Persian line. Second, it would take his men off the artificially leveled ground that Darius had so carefully prepared for his chariots, rendering them useless. Alexander was banking everything on a single predicted moment of human error. He believed that Bessus, in his haste to chase him, would pull his cavalry so far to the side that he would, for just a moment, open a gap in the Persian line. And in that moment, Alexander, with his companion cavalry coiled like a spring, would abandon his diagonal march, pivot, and lead a decisive, wedge-shaped charge directly into that gap. He would not attack the army. He would ride straight for the center. He would ride straight for Darius. The deployments were complete. The sun was high enough for the work to begin. Across the plain, a great suffocating silence fell. 500,000 men held their breath. The chessboard was set. The first piece was about to move. The battle began, but it did not begin with the crash of infantry or the thunder of a charge. It began with the most bizarre, unnerving sight. Alexander, at the head of his right wing, gave the order. And the entire wing began to march, not forward but diagonally to the right, in perfect oblique formation. They were marching at an angle, seemingly away from the Persian center, as if intending to simply walk off the edge of the battlefield. From his high chariot in the center of the Persian line, Darius watched this maneuver with growing confusion, which quickly turned to frustration. This was not the battle he had planned. Alexander was ignoring his massive center. Worse, with every step, Alexander's men were moving off the carefully leveled ground that Darius had prepared for his chariots. Alexander was deliberately spoiling the trap. Darius realized he was losing control of the engagement. He had to force the battle, and he had to do it now. He gave the signal. The ground began to tremble. From the front of the Persian line, the 200 scythed chariots lurched into motion. The horses were whipped into a frenzy, and the chariots surged forward in a wave of spinning iron, a deafening rumble of wheels and hooves aimed directly at the heart of the Macedonian phalanx. This was the weapon that was meant to shatter the invincible line. This was the stroke that was meant to win the war. The phalanx, however, was ready. They had been drilled for this exact moment. As the chariots thundered closer, the Macedonian light infantry, the javelin men, stepped forward and hurled a cloud of projectiles. They aimed not for the chariots, but for the horses and the drivers. Some chariots their drivers killed veered wildly off course. Others, their horses wounded, tumbled into ruin. But most of the chariots came on, and as they reached the main line of spears, the Macedonian officers bellowed their orders. The phalanx, that solid wall of men, did the unthinkable. It opened, the front ranks parted, creating wide, clear channels through the formation. It was a perfectly executed mousetrap. The chariot drivers, galloping at full speed, had no way to stop or steer. They were funneled harmlessly through these gaps, into the open space behind the Macedonian line. There, the army's reserve troops and cavalry grooms, waiting with pikes and heavy swords, simply swarmed the now useless chariots, pulling the drivers to the ground and killing the horses. In a matter of minutes, Darius's secret weapon, the key to his entire strategy, had been completely and totally neutralized. It had inflicted almost zero casualties. The phalanx closed its ranks. The great wall of spears was whole once more, and the men stood, waiting, as if nothing had happened. Darius was now in serious trouble. His first move had failed. Alexander was still marching to the right, drawing ever further away. Desperate, Darius ordered his left-wing cavalry, under the command of Bessus, to ride out and stop Alexander's flank. The Scythian and Bactrian horsemen, the finest in the empire, charged. They collided with Alexander's own flanking cavalry in a massive, swirling melee. A desperate battle began on the far right wing, with dust rising to obscure the sun, a chaotic fight of horsemen trying to outflank one another. And at the very same time, on the far side of the field, Darius's right-wing general, Mazaeus, finally unleashed his own grand assault. He threw his entire massive force of Mesopotamian cavalry against the Macedonian left, held by the outnumbered Parmenian. This was the battle Darius had planned. This was the envelopment. Parmenian's line was hit by a tidal wave of horses and men. The old general's troops were in a desperate fight for survival. The line was bending. Gaps were opening. Parmenian's men were dying, and the anvil was beginning to crack. This was the moment of supreme crisis. The Macedonian left was on the verge of collapse. The Macedonian right was locked in a life-or-death struggle with the Scythians. The battle was descending into the very chaos Darius had wanted. But in the center, Alexander himself was not engaged. He was watching. He was waiting. He saw Bessus commit his entire cavalry force to the flank battle, trying to stop the Macedonian advance. He saw the Persian left wing pulling further and further away from its own center. And he saw that Darius in the center had remained stationary, holding his immortals in reserve. And then, it happened. Exactly as Alexander had predicted. Between the charging, frantic cavalry of Bessus on the far left and the static, waiting infantry of Darius in the center, a gap opened. It was a momentary fatal void in the Persian line. For this single perfect second, Alexander had waited. He had sacrificed his left wing. He had baited the Persian cavalry, and now his moment had come. He gave the signal. He abandoned his diagonal march. He wheeled his companion cavalry, which he had held in reserve. They formed into their famous, terrifying, wedge-shaped formation, with Alexander himself at the absolute tip, his helmet unmistakable. This was not a charge to save his flank. This was not a charge to win a cavalry fight. This was a single 3,000-man projectile, aimed at the void. They bypassed the swirling melee on the flank and drove like a spearhead deep into the gap, aiming for only one target in the entire Persian army. They were aiming for the royal chariot of the great king himself. The Macedonian wedge, with Alexander at its very point, tore through the breach in the Persian line. They were not met by panicked infantry, but by the elite of the empire, the Greek mercenaries and the royal immortals, who threw themselves in front of their king, fighting with the desperate courage of men protecting their god. The fighting was brutal, a chaotic melee of spear and sword, but the momentum of the companion cavalry was unstoppable. Through the dust and the blood, Darius, from his high chariot, saw the helmet of Alexander. He saw the young king, a figure of seemingly supernatural fury, cutting his way through the finest bodyguard in the world. He was getting closer. This was the moment. The second time in his life that the great king had been forced to look his rival in the eye. And for the second time, his nerve broke. He saw the spears of his immortals snapping. He saw his Greek mercenaries falling back. He knew that in moments, that blood-soaked figure would be upon him. Darius yanked the reins of his royal chariot, turning the massive armored carriage around in a desperate, clumsy panic. He lashed his horses and fled from the battle, abandoning his men, his empire, and his honor to save his own life. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The royal standard of the King of Kings, the emblem of the entire empire, was seen racing from the field. A cry went up from the Persian center. "The king has fled!" It was the single fatal blow. The men who had been fighting and dying to protect their king now had nothing left to fight for. Their courage shattered. The entire Persian center broke, throwing down their weapons, turning their backs, and running for their lives. The rout spread to the left wing under Bessus, which was already under pressure. That entire side of the battlefield dissolved into a tide of panicked men, a disorganized mob, all fleeing the man their king had abandoned them to. Alexander had won. The field was his. But the war was not over as long as Darius lived. He gathered his companions, their horses breathing heavily, and began the pursuit. He would run Darius down. He would end this today. He had not ridden more than a mile when a single frantic horseman, galloping from the rear, finally caught him. The man was a messenger from Parmenion. He was screaming for help. The message was dire. The Macedonian left flank was not routing. It was being destroyed. Mazaeus and his cavalry, in their massive assault, had broken through. They had bypassed Parmenion's line and were in the Macedonian rear, attacking the baggage camp, slaughtering the non-combatants. Parmenion's men were surrounded on the verge of total annihilation. This was Alexander's defining test, not as a warrior, but as a king. In front of him, on the road, was Darius. Capturing him meant the end of the war and ultimate personal glory. Behind him, his army, his countrymen, the men who had followed him across the world, were being slaughtered. He made the choice. It was the hardest and most professional decision of his life. He abandoned the pursuit of Darius. He would let the crown of Asia slip through his fingers to save the men who had won it for him. He gave the order to halt. The companions, frustrated but disciplined, wheeled their tired horses around, and they charged back into the battle. This, by all accounts, was the bloodiest and hardest fighting of the entire day. The Macedonians slammed into the victorious Persian cavalry of Mazaeus. It was a chaotic, grinding, brutal battle within a battle, but the Persian horsemen, who thought they had won, now looked up to see their king had fled. The rest of their army was gone, and Alexander himself, leading his elite cavalry, was charging them from the rear. The fight went out of them. Their victory had become a trap. They too broke and joined the great rout, fleeing west to escape the field. The sun began to set on the plain of Gaugamela. A great silence, broken only by the cries of the wounded, fell over the field. Alexander was the undisputed master. The Persian army, the largest ever assembled, had ceased to exist. Darius had escaped, a fugitive, but he was now a king with no army and no empire. The war was effectively over. The pursuit of Darius would become a manhunt, but the fate of the world had been sealed. In the days that followed, Alexander marched his army south. He was no longer an invader. He was the undisputed ruler of Asia. When he reached the mighty walls of Babylon, the gates were not barred. They were thrown open. The people of the ancient city lined the streets, but they did not throw stones. They threw flowers. Incense burned from every rooftop. The Persian general Mazaeus, the one who had fought so bravely against Parmenion, was the one who came to surrender the city, and he was honored by Alexander for his courage. Alexander rode into the greatest city on earth, not as a destroyer, but as a liberator. The Achaemenid Empire, which had ruled the known world for over 2 centuries, had been given its death blow by a single charge, on a single dusty plain. The age of Persia was over. The age of Alexander had begun, and the world would never be the same.